Direct and indirect taxes. Common interpretation by Neil S. Sigel and Stephen G. Willis. Despite this essay's title, the Constitution permits three classes of taxation. 1. Direct taxes, which must be apportioned among the states in proportion to their populations. 2. Indirect taxes, specifically duties imposed and exercises which must be uniform throughout the country. And 3. Income taxes on humans, as opposed to businesses or other entities, which may apply to income derived from a source. A brief history of U.S. tax law. Much discussion preceding the Constitution divided taxes into the direct and indirect categories. However, the Constitution never adopted that precise distinction. See the Federalist number 36, Alexander Hamilton. Nevertheless, Supreme Court decisions such as the license tax cases, 1867, and routinely use direct-indirect dichotomy. As early as 1796 in Hamilton versus United States, the Supreme Court wrestled with direct-indirect dichotomy. As the court explained in that case, direct taxes must be apportioned while indirect taxes, duties, imposed and exercises must be uniform, and any other tax, if possible, must be uniform. The code had the tax on carriages to be indirect because it applied to the use of the carriage rather than to the property itself, an arguably nuanced distinction. In 1895, the Supreme Court held general income tax unconstitutional as an unapportioned direct tax, distinguishing it from a tax on business or employment income, which the court described as a permissible exercise, an indirect tax. Pollock versus Farmers Loan Trust Corporation, 1895. In contrast, the court held in 1911 that the tax on corporate income was constitutional as a uniform exercise, a type of indirect tax. Flint versus Stone Tracy Corporation, 1911. The court reasoned that the original income tax applied directly to humans, while the corporate income tax applied through the corporate entity. Humans might suffer the taxes through higher prices or lower profits, but they would do so indirectly. In 1913, the 16th Amendment authorized an unapportioned tax on income derived from a source. The country adopted the amendment to reverse the 1895 Pollock decision. Many later decisions have wrestled with the right requirement. The best description requires income to constitute a cession to wealth, clearly realized, over which the taxpayer has complete dominion. Commissioner versus Glenshore Glass, 1955. Although some writers describe the direct, indirect, and apportionment uniformity requirements as antiquated, the dichotomy have at least some modern significance. To grasp that significance, one needs to understand the underlying terms. Direct tax apportionment. The direct tax applied to land or directed to humans without regard to property, profession, or any other circumstance. Hilton versus United States, 1796. See also NFIB versus Sibelius, 2012. Such a tax must be apportioned. At the time, the Constitutional Convention, states with large amounts of land, as well as those with large populations, feared heavier taxes on their landed population, including slaves, as compared to smaller and less populous states. The apportionment requirement, which also governs representation in the House of Representatives, became the compromise. See Article 1, Section 2. To be apportioned, a tax must be the same amount per person in every state, a very difficult burden to satisfy. For example, $1 per anchor tax would fail unless every state had the same anchorage per capita. As a result, the federal land taxes do not exist. States, unhampered by apportionment, routinely impose real property taxes. In contrast, the dollar per human tax, also known as a capitation, would be constitutional as it would be the same amount per capita in every state. The United States, however, has never imposed such a tax, arguably the only form that a direct tax could constitutionally take. In 2012, the Supreme Court considered whether the shared responsibility payment for lacking health insurance in the Affordable Care Act was direct tax, and held that it was not, while applied directly to humans. It varied depending on whether they have health insurance and other circumstances. NFIB versus Sibelius, quoting Hilton, the court held the requirement payment to be non-direct, as citing Pollack concluded that the payment is not an income tax. Indirect tax uniformity. Duties imposed and exercised must be uniform. See Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. As indirect taxes, they do not apply directly to humans. For example, a duty applied to the acts of importing property, although the ultimate purchaser suffers a tax as the instance or burden of the tax is sought to fall primarily on the importer, and therefore it is considered to be indirect. Exercises are commonly applied to tires, telephone charges, gambling, employment, and corporate income. In each case, humans may ultimately suffer the tax through higher prices or lower wages, but the incidence is viewed as indirect through the seller, employer, or entity. Unlike apportionment, uniformity does not require each person to pay the same amount. Instead, it requires the same rate structure that exists nationally. For example, Congress may tax truck tires differently from bicycle tires, but the average taxes to truck tires, especially truck tire rates, must be the same in every state. As such, it is geographical requirement. Stewart Machine Corporation vs. Davis, 1937. Flint vs. Stone Tracy Corporation, 1911. Norton vs. Moore, 1900. The Supreme Court has never struck down an indirect tax as a failing uniformity, although it has considered the issue several times. Uniformity of analysis is not easily reducible to black letter rules. Nevertheless, some such rules emerge. 1. Taxes may vary by object's value or the taxpayer's income so long as the rates are uniform. They may even apply to objects or transactions found only in some states, such as snow tires in the north or beach umbrellas in coastal states. Adai versus Robertson, Head Money Case 1884. 2. Tax rates may vary based on physical such as coastlines, the frigid conditions. However, such variations necessitate a particularly close examination. For instance, in United States versus Binsinski, 1983, the court distinguished Arctic oil from oil produced elsewhere. It upheld the tax on income derived from oil pumped above the Arctic Circle. Rates may also vary because of isolated problems or diverse conditions. Florida versus Mellon, 1927. How isolated or diverse a problem or condition must be is unclear. Income taxes derived. Income taxes may be imposed only on derived income. This realization event requirement generally referred to a transaction other than the mere passage of time. Thus, the 16th Amendment permits taxation of gains from sales or exchanges of property, but not those resulting merely from increased values. It also permits taxes on rents and interest. Although direct, such taxes need not be apportioned because the amendment eliminates the apportionment requirements for income taxes. Matters of debate. The first opinion. Still, we're narrow after all these years, and rightly so. Manuel S. Siegel. The first clause of Article 1, Section 9 is known as the Direct Tax Clause. It provides that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. This clause requires that the financial burden of any direct tax imposed by Congress fall equally on each state in the Union in terms of its population. For example, two states have the same population, then the citizens of each state collectively must pay the same amount of direct tax to the U.S. Treasury. While it's clear how apportionment works, it was less clear in the times of founding which kind of taxes qualify as direct, and so were subject to apportionment. According to Madison's notes of proceedings, as a Constitution Convention in 1787, Massachusetts delegates refused King at one point asked what was the precise meaning of direct taxation. No one answered. The text of Section 9 contemplates that capitation taxes, otherwise known as head or poll taxes, qualify as direct taxes. Capitations are taxes on people in simple virtue of the fact that it exists. The constitutional text also seems to imply that at least one other kind of tax qualifies as direct. The original purpose of requiring apportionment for direct federal taxes appeared to have been to benefit southern states. Specifically, the apportionment requirement was primarily designed to render impractical federal head taxes on slaves and federal taxes on land, both major sources of wealth in 18th century America. Without the requirement of apportionment by state population, the burden of both kinds of federal taxes would have fallen mostly heavily on the South because it possessed disproportionately more wealth in landed slaves than indeed the North. By contrast, apportioning any such tax by state population would have fallen mostly heavily on the North because it was the home to the most popular states. This original purpose explains why the third clause, Article 1, Section 2, provides that both representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. The more people who live in the state, the more representation in Congress that the state receives, and the more its citizens collectively pay indirect taxes. The practical consequence of requiring apportionment for head taxes on slaves, the taxes on land was that the federal government did not tax slaves or land. The 13th Amendment ended the possibility of head taxes on slaves, and to this day, Americans do not pay property tax to the federal government. From the beginning, the Supreme Court had understood only were a few taxes to be subjected to the apportionment requirement. It is the first case considered the issue, Helton versus United States, 1796. The justice who wrote opinions including only capitation and land taxes within the category of direct taxes. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the court upheld federal taxes that had not been apportioned on insurance premiums, city-backed notes, inheritances, trees, personal income, the corporate income. The court reasoned that all of those taxes were excise taxes, not direct taxes. See, example, Bruce Ackerman, Taxation and Constitution, 99, Clum's Law Review 1, 1999. The major exception is the court's decision in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Corporation, 1895, which invalidated the progressive federal income tax statute then in effect. In that case, the court remarkably and inconsistently held that the federal taxation income that was derived from real or personal property such as rental or dividend income was direct and subject to apportionment, in contrast to income taxes on wages and business profit, which were not. The Pollock court confused matter by reasoning that certain income taxes could qualify as direct taxes on the underlying property from which the income was derived. The 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913 in order to overrule the decision. It authorizes Congress to tax incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment of the several states, thus striking the previous long-standing rule on direct taxes. The 16th Amendment makes clear that income, not ownership, is being taxed. So there is no requirement for apportionment, and there's no constitutional problem. Today, the direct tax clause operates to render impracticable only federal capitations, federal taxes on the ownership of land, and the federal taxes on personal property. Murphy's RIS, D.C. Circuit 2007, for example, the minimum coverage provision in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, ACA, requires most individuals to either obtain health insurance or make a payment to the Internal Revenue Service. In NIFIB versus Sebelius 2012, the Supreme Court, after upholding the required payment as a tax for purposes of the taxing clause in the first clause, Article 1, Section 8, rejects the argument that it was a direct tax that so had to be apportioned. The court's holding is plainly correct. The required payment for going without health insurance is in the ACA is a tax on those who choose to remain uninsured, not a head tax on those who simply exist, or a tax on land ownership or a tax on personal property. It is therefore not a direct tax and need not be apportioned. Except in Pollock, the court has been right all these years to define the category of direct taxes over narrowly and discuss narrow definitions most consistent with the constitutional text. The original purpose of the direct tax clause, the court's precedent, and the 16th Amendment. Another definition also makes good sense from a consequentialist perspective. The Constitution confers robust federal power to tax on the theory, grounded in experience, that Taxation with representation is a necessity. Requiring apportionment, however, rendered federal taxation impractical. Apportionment also requires the federal government to privilege regressivity over progressivity in taxation. Apportionment means that the citizens of relatively wealthy states must pay at a lower rate than citizens of relatively poor states in order to make the total payment for states of equal population come out the same. Such a tax regime is difficult to defend morally, particularly in America, in which the income distribution is increasingly skewed in favor of a very small number of extraordinarily wealthy Americans. Finally, such a tax regime is difficult to defend from a structural federalism perspective. States that impose progressive taxes are at a competitive disadvantage in attracting wealthy residents relative to states that do not. For example, and here read Amar, American Constitution, Biography, 2005. Only progressive taxation at the federal level can overcome the collective action problem and avoid a destructive race to the bottom. Now, next perspective, direct and indirect dichotomy. Relevant today by Stephen G. Willis. The direct and indirect taxes dichotomy remain important because it affects the type of tax the federal government can impose. Classification between the two categories, as well as application of the apportionment and uniformity tests, can determine the validity of modern statutes. Very difficult to satisfy. The apportionment requirement can be met only with a capitation, a direct tax on humans simply because they are humans. To satisfy apportionment, the tax would necessarily be the same per person nationwide. Congress has never enacted such a tax and arguably is unlikely to do so in the foreseeable future. The inequality requirement is a powerful restriction on taxing power. Remember, the income tax is progressive and applies much more heavily on high-income persons than on others. Because income tax is not subject to apportionment, largely because of the 16th Amendment, progressivity is possible. In addition, Congress cannot impose a property tax on land. Apportioning such a tax would be impossible because the amount of land per person is not the same in every state. Land tax is known as ad valorem, and property taxes, however, are very important to the states, with many states raising a substantial portion of the revenue from them. Restricting such taxes to the states is another very significant restriction on the federal taxing power. Although the Congress cannot impose a property tax directly on personal property such as cars, furniture, stocks, or bonds, as opposed to land, it has two fairly easy workarounds for such taxes. In FIB versus Sebelius, 2012, since 1796, the Supreme Court has ruled tax on the use of personal property as indirect tax subject to uniformity rather than to apportionment. Hilton versus United States, 1796, Chase G. As a result, it can easily style a tax on automobiles as a tax on the use of the item and thus avoid apportionment. Indeed, because the number of cars or any other personal item is unlikely ever to be the same per capita in every state without the Hilton decision, a federal personal property tax would be impossible because it could never satisfy apportionment. Although Congress does not often impose direct taxes on personal property, Congress routinely imposes similar taxes on the purchase of personal property such as tires and gasoline starting them as exercise subjects merely to uniformity. Significantly, it could impose a nationwide automobile or telephone usage tax. Until 1913, a tax on either personal or real property income was effectively forbidden because such taxes were considered direct and not easily apportioned. Pollock versus Farmers Loan, the Trust Corporation, 1895. The 16th Amendment results by replacing the income tax apportionment requirement with a new requirement that a tax on income need not to be apportioned so long as the tax is imposed on income derived from a source, a serious but different restriction. In 2012, the Supreme Court narrowly rated the direct tax definition in relation to the Affordable Care Act, ACA. The court held the ACA penalty on persons without minimum health insurance to be a tax. However, the court also held it not to be any kind of direct tax, NFIB versus Superiors 2012. In so doing, the court made two critical points. First, by citing Pollock favorably, the court removed any argument that the penalty was supportable as income tax subject to derived tax. That was important because the tax is, in part, a function of a person's income. Without the 16th Amendment as a possible foundation, the tax penalty must satisfy either apportionment or uniformity. Second, the court relied on the often quoted 1796 Hilton language: a direct tax is one imposed without regard to property, profession, or any other circumstance. Finally, the language of health insurance and another circumstance. The court found that the mandate to purchase insurance was not direct tax and rejected apportionment as applying to the ACA. Interestingly, the court quoted Justice Chase out of the contest. Chase actually said, "I am inclined to think, but if this I do not give a judicial opinion, that the direct taxes contemplated by the Constitution are only two, to wit, a capitation of poll tax simply, without regard to property, profession, or any other circumstances, and the tax on land." Hilton versus United States, 1796 Chase G. Chase. The NFIB court thus omitted Chase's independent clause and quoted only the dependent clause, which he described as not his judicial opinion, or it labeled the quotation as opinion of Chase G, which is best described as misleading. Nevertheless, the NFIB decision appears settled. The ACE tax is neither direct tax nor an income tax. With discussions of tax, now personal notes, Chase was actually, prior to become a Supreme Court judge, was actually I think, a Minister of Treasury for Lincoln during Lincoln time. So anyway, let's move on. But discussion of tax, which is neither direct nor an income tax, necessarily raises the issue of uniformity. Uniformity is much easier to satisfy requirements and apportionment. It's all about geography. The tax must apply the same in every state. Now back to the former notes. As recalled, Chase actually played a major role to raise up finances for supporting the Civil War. So his words were experienced and were knowledgeable in terms of taxation and financial management of the nation. So anyway, let's move on. Few Supreme Court decisions have applied uniformity and none has invalidated the tax because of it. Essentially, the geographical elements uniformity applies in a laxier manner if the natural geographical variations among states justify a lack of uniformity, or if a particular state's behavior causes it. For example, the court upheld the charge on immigration through seaports through It has no impact on landlocked states, finding that there was substantial uniformity. Adai versus Robertson had money cases 1884. Similarly, in 1983, the court upheld a difference between taxes on income from oil pumped above the Arctic Circle and taxes on income from oil pumped elsewhere, noting that there were important natural differences in the oil and the extraction process. United States versus Pinsinski, 1983. In 1927, the court upheld the estate tax, although it ultimately applied differently to Florida. Florida was melon, 1927. The difference, however, resulted from particular Florida statute, which created a lack of uniformity. The state cannot self-impose non-uniformity and then complain about it. Significantly, the NFIB decision did not discuss uniformity. The court likely avoided addressing this issue because it was premature, because the act was not yet operable. No facts indicating uniformity or the lack thereof were available. Since 2014, however, the tax on persons without health insurance has applied differently in the various states. It varies as a function of the cost health insurances in states as well as the federal poverty level, which itself varies between Alaska, Hawaii, and other states. As a result, the ECA tax can vary from one person to another, even though the two persons may reside less than a mile apart. The only important distinction may be the man-made political boundary between them, the state line. Whether the Supreme Court will hear a case challenging the ACE for lack of uniformity is unclear. If it does, that may be the first instance in which the constitutional restriction has a real impact.